It's cold, it stinks, and you're chained to a wall. To the dungeon. Tonight, we are not visiting the courts of kings or the cloisters of monks. There are no flickering torches, in noble halls, no velvet robes, just stone, damp, heavy, and unfeeling. Beneath the castles, the keeps, and the courtrooms, there was another world, a quieter world, a darker one, a world of rusted chains, stale bread, and time that passed without meaning, not exciting, not dramatic, endlessly grim. And while stories of torture and screaming echo through imagination, the truth is often far more uneventful. And in many ways, even worse. This was a world where hours crawled like rats, where silence became deafening, and where the only warmth came from the breath of your own body, curled in a corner, half forgotten, beneath layers of stone. But before we descend into the cell, we begin above, at the door, with the one who held the keys. Imagine a narrow passage carved in stone, the walls rough, uneven, and damp to the touch. A torch flickers somewhere far off, casting uncertain shadows that stretch like old bones. Footsteps echo against stone, slow, steady, deliberate. This is not the prisoner. This is the man who watches them rot. The jailer. He is not what most expect. Not a sadistic executioner, not a faceless brute in armor. More often, he is tired, middle-aged, hunched, with hands calloused from years of keys and chains. His world is routine, less about cruelty, more about control. He manages people who have been removed from society, criminals, accused heretics, debtors, soldiers on the wrong side of a failed war. His job is to ensure they do not leave. There is no uniform, just rough clothing, dark with years of smoke, sweat, and grease. A simple knife on his belt, a ring of keys clanking at his hip. He carries a torch or a lantern, the flames sputtering with each draft that creeps up from below. He begins his morning before the sun rises. The upper world, the castle or courthouse above, may still be asleep, but below, in the dungeon, the stink never sleeps. Before descending, he checks supplies. Rations of stale bread, buckets of water, extra straw. A ledger kept in rough ink records names, charges, and punishments. Often, the ink fades before the names are cleared. The jailer walks a narrow stairwell downward. With each step, the air grows colder, heavier, older. The smell hits partway down, a mixture of mildew, unwashed bodies, urine, mold, and rust. It's in the walls, in the wood, in his clothes. He lights torches in wall brackets. As he goes, the light flickers weakly, casting more shadow than clarity. You can hear the scurrying of rats behind the stones. Sometimes, they're louder than the prisoners. He opens the door to the main corridor. Iron hinges groan, and there, lined along both sides, are the cells. Each one is a small box, iron bars on one side, stone on all others. Inside, a prisoner, or what remains of one. A bundle of rags, a shadow of a man, a curled figure sleeping or pretending to. The jailer stops at each cell in turn. He checks the chains. Tight, secure, anchored deep in the wall. Some prisoners are shackled by wrists, others by ankles. Some lie loose, but weak from confinement. Very few speak. He drops a piece of bread onto the floor, slides in a clay cup of water. Sometimes it is clean, sometimes not. He does not explain. He does not console. He does not threaten. He simply moves on. The jailer's world is small, not by size, but by scope. He does not leave often. He sleeps in a chamber near the stairs, close enough to hear any shouting from below, though there is rarely shouting anymore. The longer prisoners stay, the quieter they become. His room is basic, a cot with a thin blanket, a small table, a wooden chest for belongings. The walls sweat like the ones downstairs, though he has a brazier to fight the worst of the chill. A lantern hangs from a hook near his bed. He lights it each night by habit, though there's little to do after dark. He keeps a ledger, though he doesn't always update it. It contains names, dates, sometimes a charge, if one was provided, suspected theft, unruly. One page just says, priest. He doesn't ask for details. He is not a judge. He is not an executioner. He is not meant to care. But even if he does not ask, he knows things. He knows that some prisoners were brought in without cause. He knows that one man was meant to be released 3 months ago. The order never came. The court clerk forgot, or the document was misplaced. The man no longer speaks. He stares at the wall, mouth slightly open, eyes on. The jailer once tried to speak to him. No answer. Now, he simply replaces the straw, sets the bread down near the man's feet, and moves on. He remembers those who died, not out of sentiment, but because they changed the routine. One woman sang every night, a single verse from a song. He never learned the rest. It was haunting. Then one day it stopped. He checked the cell. She was gone, not dead, just moved. Higher up, maybe, or out. He never saw her again, but sometimes the tune still comes back to him while he eats. He sharpens tools in his free time, not weapons, just maintenance. A small handsaw, a hammer. The locks rust often. Moisture eats the hinge. Sometimes he must remove a bolt entirely and replace it with one from a chest of spares. His hands are always stained. Rust, ash, old blood. He no longer tries to scrub it all off. Food is delivered from the castle kitchen. It arrives lukewarm, in clay pots, on a tray. Some for him, some for the prisoners. He eats first, then sorts the rest. Bread for the older prisoners, softer porridge for those who can no longer chew. Water for all, unless there's none left. On bad days, he has to stretch a single bucket between 6 or 7 cells. He doesn't enjoy that. He doesn't enjoy much. Sometimes he sees himself in the iron of a door, a rough reflection, just enough to catch the outline of his face. It has changed. More lines, deeper hollows beneath the eyes. He rarely speaks to the guards anymore. They come, they drop off a prisoner, they leave. Sometimes they laugh about it, make jokes. He doesn't join in. The prisoners recognize him. Most say nothing. Some nod. One called him father once, delirious with fever. He didn't correct her. She died that night. He buried her himself, out behind the lower wall, where the soil turns to clay. He dug a hole with a rusted spade, said nothing over the grave, and marked it with a stone that already had moss on it. No one asked where she went. No one came to collect her. There are times he thinks about leaving. He could go. The door is open to him. He is not chained like them. But where would he go? This place, this echo of stone, this rhythm of keys and footsteps and wheezing breath. It has become part of him. When he walks through the town, he walks as if the walls are still close. When he eats at home, the silence unnerves him. When someone calls his name on the street, he flinches. He carries the dungeon in his bones now. In the smell of his coat, in the scars on his hands, in the deep, dull ache behind his eyes when he wakes too early, thinking he missed a bell that no longer rings. Some say jailers are cruel, that they enjoy the suffering of others. Some do, but most are simply worn down, eroded by time, by proximity, by sameness. He was not always like this. He once had a garden. He once had a wife. He once wrote poetry, though he rarely showed it. Now his handwriting is utilitarian, blocky, just enough to note a name. He walks the hall again, checks the locks. One prisoner is curled so tightly in the corner that he appears faceless. Another scratches at the wall with a bone fragment. He lets him. A younger prisoner pleads quietly for water. The jailer brings some. The man nods in thanks. The jailer says nothing. Later, he sits on a stool, closes his eyes, and listens. He hears the dripping, the occasional cough, a creak from the far gate, the whisper of a prayer half remembered from a cell 3 doors down, and for a moment he feels nothing. Not sorrow, not satisfaction, just stillness, and then the keys shift at his side, and he stands, because routine never waits. Evening comes slowly in a dungeon. There is no sunset, no golden light stretching across flagstones, only the gradual dimming of what little brightness made its way down the stairwell earlier in the day. The jailer doesn't mark the time by shadows. He marks it by temperature. The air grows colder, heavier. The moisture on the walls thickens. The stones seem to breathe differently, exhaling a deeper chill. He pulls his cloak tighter and begins his evening round. The hallway is quiet. Some prisoners are asleep, or pretending to be, or simply lying still, with no energy to move. One of them, an older man, groans softly with each breath, not in pain, just with effort. Each breath sounds like it takes work. The jailer pauses, listens, then moves on. He doesn't have medicine. There is none to give. He doesn't offer words. What would he say? He opens a supply box near the stairs, pulls out a fresh length of rope, tests it for strength, not because he plans to use it tonight, but because things must be kept ready. Everything must be in place, in case someone asks for it, even if they never do. In a locked cabinet nearby, he keeps shackles. spare ones. Some are older than him. Some were forged in haste, their edges rough and uneven. He oils the hinges of a gate that sticks. It screeches less now, not silent, but duller. These small acts of maintenance are his craft. They give shape to his day. They offer control. In a world that has none, he writes a new entry in the ledger. Male approx 30, placed in cell 7. The handwriting is tight and square. He underlines the cell number. He always does. It's a small habit. No one notices but him. He eats dinner at his table. A heel of bread, some boiled onions, a bowl of thin broth. It's the same as the prisoners, only served warm. He eats in silence. There is no fire tonight. He didn't bother lighting it. After the meal, he walks the corridor once more. He stops at cell 2. The prisoner inside has not moved since morning. He watches, listens. The man's chest rises faintly, still breathing. The jailer replaces the straw. He doesn't have to, but he does. The old straw is blackened, sour, stiff. He drags it out with a hooked stick, tosses it into a bucket, and spreads the new layer. It smells faintly of the barn. The scent doesn't last. The prisoner doesn't acknowledge him. His eyes are open but unblinking. His gaze fixed somewhere behind the wall. The jailer says nothing. He locks the door again, moves on. In the far cell, a younger man asks if he will be released soon. His voice is hoarse, hopeful, but brittle. The jailer does not answer. He doesn't know. He's stopped asking the clerks for updates. They don't like to be reminded of who's still below. They move on to newer paperwork, newer names. Some prisoners are simply forgotten. He returns to his stool. His lamp is nearly out. The oil burns low, casting a soft, orange halo that dances across the ledger on the table. He leafs through older pages, names scratched out, marked dead, marked moved, some with question marks, one with a smudged ink blot where a name should have been. He thinks about those people, where they went, if anyone remembered them when they left, if they were buried with their names, if their families ever knew. He closes the ledger. Outside, a storm is rising. He can hear the wind whistling through a crack above the stairwell. Water will seep in. It always does. He stands again, walks the corridor once more, not because he has to, but because he always does. Routine is what keeps things from falling apart. At least that's what he believes. Or used to. He checks the locks, checks the gates, listens to the breathing weights. There is no satisfaction in the work. No pride, just ... continuity. He is part of the stone now, not because he chose to be, but because stone wears down everything, even him, when he dreams. And he does, though not often. He dreams not of light, or freedom. He dreams of the sound of keys, the creak of gates, the cold press of walls around him. His shift includes more than feeding. He must record deaths, check for signs of escape, rarely necessary, as few have the strength to stand, clean out the waste buckets. Sometimes, when a prisoner has died, he is called to drag the body out and replace it with someone new. There is no ceremony. There are moments of violence, yes, but more often, there is boredom, stillness, the weight of time pressing down. The jailer knows these faces. He does not always remember their names. Some have been here for weeks, some for years, some for no reason at all, recorded by mistake or left behind in a forgotten corner of the justice system. The jailer rarely questions why. That is not his job. His job is the routine, and the routine never changes. He carries a bucket of fresh straw, tossing handfuls into cells. It lands in damp piles. No bed, just straw and stone. Sometimes he speaks to a prisoner. A single word, a command, or move quiet, but more often, he says nothing. He hears coughing, groaning, whispering, sometimes the scraping of nails on stone, sometimes prayers, sometimes laughter, dry, cracked, unsettling. He has seen men lose their minds here, seen them cry, then laugh, then forget their own names. He has seen men die in silence, and others scream for days. But the work remains the same. The jailer returns to his stool in a small chamber off the hall. It is warmer there, barely. A small brazier smokes in the corner. A pot of thin soup bubbles on a metal hook. He eats slowly, eyes never leaving the corridor. Later, a guard might descend with a new arrival. A woman, a thief, a beggar, a soldier. He takes the name, checks the shackles, adds a line to the ledger. No one explains anything to her. The door closes, the key turns, and the jailer sits back down, listens, waits. He knows he will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because the dungeon does not sleep, it does not forgive, it only continues, and he, like its prisoners, is simply part of the stone. Imagine the cell. You might think of iron bars, maybe a bench, perhaps a window. But that's not quite right. A medieval dungeon cell is far simpler, and far less forgiving. The space is narrow, 6 feet by 8, sometimes less. The walls are made of rough, unpolished stone, mortared thick, cold to the touch even in summer. In winter, they don't just radiate cold, they become it. There is no insulation, no warmth stored from the day before. The cold lives here. It has permanence. The walls aren't dry. Moisture seeps in slowly from the ground, from rain above, from decades of use. Water pools in corners and glistens on the ceiling. The smell is unmistakable. A damp, earthy rot that never fades. A blend of mildew, old urine, sweat, and the long decayed remains of things left too long in the dark. There is no bed, not even a wooden slab. At best, the floor is scattered with straw, if it's been recently replaced. More often, it's the same straw from last week, or the week before, or longer. It is flattened, blackened, stained. It sticks to skin when wet, and it is always wet. There are no If the prisoner is lucky, they may have retained a layer of clothing. Sometimes not. Sometimes they are left with rags, a torn tunic, threadbare leggings, nothing more. There are no toilets, only buckets. Small, wooden, reused. The bucket might be emptied every day, it might not. It depends on the jailer. Sometimes he forgets. Sometimes he remembers and chooses not to. The smell builds. There is no privacy, of course. The cell is open on one side, a heavy iron gate with vertical bars, or in some cases, just a grated opening through which a guard might peer. If the prisoner is not shackled to the wall, they may huddle in a corner, turn away. But there is nowhere to hide. Food comes once a day, sometimes twice. A lump of dark bread, hard at the edges, coarse and filled with more husk than grain. A clay cup of water, sometimes clear, sometimes not. On rare days, a spoonful of porridge, thin and sour. If supplies are low, the food is shared between two. If the prisoner is disliked, they may be skipped entirely. No utensils, no dishes, just fingers and the floor. And always, the cold. You cannot escape it. Even with movement, and there is little room to move, your body cannot stay warm. There are no fires, no torches within the cell, only the dim flicker of a lantern in the hallway, if lit at all. On many nights, the dungeon is in near total darkness. You can see your breath. You can hear the slow drip of water from the ceiling into a puddle on the floor, drip, drip, drip. Endless. There are creatures here too. Rats move freely. They do not fear the prisoners. They know they are faster, stronger, less broken. They skitter along the walls, crawl across feet at night, sometimes bite. They fight over the bread crust if it's left too long. Some prisoners welcome them, speak to them, even. They become companions in the silence. Lice and fleas are constant. Itching never stops. You can feel them in your hair, in your clothes, along your arms. Scratching brings relief, then bleeding, then infection. The sores come quickly in this damper, unclean space. They do not heal. The body begins to soften. Muscles waste. The skin discolors. The joints ache from cold and from stillness. Your feet swell. You stop standing as much. You curl in tighter. You begin to resemble something no longer shaped by pride or motion. Just a body, surviving. Sleep offers no comfort. There is no mattress, no quiet. You sleep curled against the wall or on the filthy straw, sometimes on bare stone. The cold reaches up from below. Your dreams blur. You wake unsure of the time. Is it morning, evening? There are no windows, no light cues, only the occasional bell from the courtyard above. Faint, distant. Time slips. You begin to mark days with scratches. On the wall, on your arm, in your mind. Then you stop. The tally doesn't matter. You've counted 30, or maybe 60, or maybe it's been a week. You forget. Voices come and go, mostly groans, coughs, mutterings from neighboring cells, sometimes screams, but rarely. Most have no energy to scream. Now and then, someone is taken. You hear the key, the chains lifted, the shuffling of feet, then silence, no explanation, no return. You wonder what they did. You wonder what you did. The silence becomes another presence. You talk to yourself, at first softly, then out loud. Sometimes you sing just one line, again and again, not for joy, but to fill the air, to feel like something exists outside your body. You find a rhythm. Eat when the food comes, if it comes. Sleep when you can. Scratch when you must. Move when your legs. Remember how you learn which stones are loose, which drip in the rain, where to curl to avoid the worst of the drafts. You do not think of escape. You think of nothing. Thinking takes energy. Energy requires food. There is no food. There is only this, and eventually, your breath becomes shallow. Your limbs cold. You curl smaller. Your voice fades. And the comforts of confinement, the straw, the bread, the wall, become all you have. And all you are. The longer you remain inside, the more the space changes. Or rather, you change, and the space remains. Your body begins to adapt in strange, unfortunate ways. The dimness, once frustrating, becomes a kind of mercy. There is nothing here you want to see in detail. Not your hands, not the floor, not the bucket in the corner. When the torches outside the cell go out and the dungeon falls into full darkness, it is not frightening. It is familiar. You begin to know the place not by sight, but by feel. There is the corner where the water drips, the small ridge where the floor isn't level, the place you lie down that doesn't slope quite as much as the rest, the chillest spot in the room, the warmest, if such a word can be used. Your other senses sharpen. You know when the jailer is coming, long before he arrives. His boots strike the stone in a distinct rhythm. He walks with a limp, slight, but constant. His keys clanked with each step. You hear them in your sleep now. You can smell things before you see them. The damped bread has a sourness when it's older than usual. The difference in water, cleanish or murky, arrives in your nose before your lips. When the straw is changed, rarely, you know by the unfamiliar crispness in the air, but mostly, everything smells the same. Heavy, sour, thick. Your skin breaks down. Rashes spread where the fabric of your rags rubs against rawness. The damp never allows anything to heal properly. The floor gives you bruises that last for weeks. Your legs weaken, muscles shrink, joints swell. You begin to move less. At first, it's out of fatigue. Later, because standing up feels foreign. Like lifting someone else's body, you forget how to walk in a straight line, how to take more than 3 steps without turning around. You talk less. The voice changes when not used. It grows quiet, like it's being pulled from farther away. The bugs never leave. Sometimes they bite. Sometimes they just crawl. The rats, bold, now come close. They sniff at your feet. They run across your back when you lie still. They know when you're no longer a threat. You try not to care. About them. About your body. About anything. But the cold is different. It does not numb. Not exactly. It creeps. It begins at the edges, toes, fingers, ears. It moves inward. You bundle tighter, even when there's nothing left to pull in. You curl into yourself. You feel your own breath on your knees and try to make it last longer. You press your cheek to your arm for just a second of warmth. You fantasize about fire, not heat. Fire, not for comfort, but just to see it again. Sometimes, your cell has a window. Very small, too high to reach. Just a slit in the wall where some light filters in. A brighter gray, now and then. You watch it. You mark the time with it. But not all cells have this. Most do not. And in those, the days blur completely. You lose track of meals. You forget the taste of anything but stale bread. Your mouth feels constantly dry, except when it's not. And then it's worse. The water sometimes tastes like the barrel, sometimes like the bucket it was carried in, sometimes like rust. You dream strange dreams, huffer memories, family, fields, voices that sound familiar but wrong. You wake and feel sad, but you're not sure why. The jailer appears. You don't speak. He doesn't either. You don't ask questions. He doesn't answer them. Sometimes you wonder if he knows your name. Sometimes you wonder if you do. Other prisoners become part of the atmosphere. You hear coughing, hacking, wet, rhythmic, always the same pattern. Then one day, it stops. You don't ask why. Someone down the corridor talks constantly. To someone who isn't there. You hear names, whole conversations, laughter, it echoes. You learn to block it out. Then one day, he stops. Too. Others moan quietly. Some pray. Some whisper. Some try to sleep all day. Sleep is hard, not because it's loud, but because the cold wakes you. The stone is unforgiving. Your body aches, and the dreams become worse. You wake up with a start. You try to recall what frightened you. You forget. You lie back down. Time becomes strange. You remember things that didn't happen. You forget things that did. You invent conversations just to have them. You practice them. You repeat them. Eventually you stop. Sometimes, you get moved to another cell, or out entirely. Sometimes they say it's temporary. It never is. Sometimes, they forget you exist. And in this state, where your body has thinned, your voice has faded, your world is reduced to a rectangle of stone and straw and dripping water, you understand what confinement truly is. It is not pain. It is not noise. It is not terror. It is the slow, unremarkable erosion of what it meant to be a person. The comforts of this place, the bread, the straw, the bucket, the moments of they are not relief. They are simply the last, flickering traces of function, and they remind you, in their own way, of everything that's gone. Time passes differently now. Not in hours, not in days. You begin to track your existence by patterns that don't belong to clocks. The way your breath fogs more in the morning than in the evening. The change in the taste of bread when it grows just slightly more sour. The intervals between footsteps in the hallway. Your internal calendar has no numbers, only sensations. You count how many times the jailer has delivered water without meeting your eyes. You count how many rats pass by while you try to sleep. You count how many days you've gone without speaking, but you lose track. And eventually, you stop counting. You no longer remember what you looked like before. There are no mirrors here, no reflections, not even in the water, which is often too murky, too shallow. You imagine your face, but the memory is soft now, like an old shirt worn smooth. You no longer move like yourself. Your gait is altered. Muscles you once used unconsciously now resist you. Standing is work. Sitting feels like gravity is stronger here. You hunch, not to hide, but because it's the only shape your body remembers. Your hands tremble when they reach out, not from fear, but from disuse. Your voice, once distinct, has flattened. When you speak, it startles even you. Rough, uncertain, papery. And when you speak to yourself, to no one, it is mostly to remind yourself that you can. You forget your name from time to time. Not entirely. It's there, somewhere. But saying it aloud feels strange, as if it belongs to someone else, as if it's a title that was once assigned to you, but now floats freely, unattached. Sometimes, you hear a new prisoner brought in. You listen. You try to guess how far down the corridor they are by the echoes. You hear their sobbing, their banging on the wall, their pleas to the jailer, to God, to anyone, and you do nothing. You don't call out, you don't respond, not because you don't care, but because you know they'll stop eventually. Everyone stops, eventually. You wonder what you were brought here for, what you were accused of, or convicted of, or mistaken for. At some point, the reason mattered. Now, it doesn't. The charge is meaningless. The sentence has no end date. There was no trial, at least not one you remember. There was only the cell, the stone, the dripping, the straw, the ache, the taste of mold in your mouth, the pressure behind your eyes when you try not to cry, the bruises that come from lying too long in one position, the prayer you forgot halfway through, the song you hummed as a child, now mangled beyond recognition, the dreams of food, faces, trees, sharp at first, then fading like smoke. There is a deep quiet inside you now, not peaceful, just still, just settled. You no longer panic when the light disappears. You no longer mark the footsteps. You no longer watch the rats. You become part of the room, not a person inside it, but a shape, a breath, a silence. Occasionally, the door opens, a visitor, a new jailer, a clerk with a paper and a list. They say your name. You blink. You recognize the word distantly. They ask if you are still alive. You say yes. Your voice cracks. They nod. They leave. Or they don't say anything at all. They just look at you, then look away. Sometimes you are forgotten. And being forgotten in here feels like a second sentence. An extension of the first. You remember stories of saints in prison, martyrs. You try to emulate them, but you're no saint. You are cold, you're hungry, you are tired, you want a bed, a fire, a name. You want someone to touch your shoulder, to speak to you in a way that doesn't involve a command, to ask you something simple, like how long it's been since you last slept well, or whether you remember your mother's voice. But no one does. So you return to your rituals. You roll up your ragged tunic into a small pillow. You curl into the same spot on the straw. You whisper a line from memory. You close your eyes. You pretend the stone is warmer than it is. And in this moment, as the cell holds you once again, you understand something most never will. That confinement is not defined by bars or chains. It is defined by absence. The absence of time, the absence of warmth, the absence of identity, and the terrible, quiet truth that eventually you grow used to it. Justice in the medieval world did not always begin with the dungeon, but it often ended there. In a time without fingerprints, without forensics, without reliable written records, guilt was not something proven so much as assumed, and the methods of proving it, when they were applied at all, followed a rhythm very different from the one we know today. It began, most often, with an accusation. Someone stole a loaf of bread. Someone insulted a noble. Someone was overheard speaking heresy in a tavern. An accusation did not require evidence. It required suspicion, a word from a neighbor, a nudge from a priest, a rumor repeated by someone the Lord happened to trust. Once accused, a person might be brought before the local bailiff, or, in larger towns, the castle steward or city magistrate. The setting was often public. A square, a hall, sometimes even the church steps. A clerk recorded the event, scribbling quickly on rough parchment. A guard stood nearby. The accused was questioned, usually with a tone that presumed guilt. Some confessed immediately. Fear was powerful, and confession, in theory, offered mercy. Others denied it. Those were the ones most in danger. If the accusation was serious, theft from the church, blasphemy, violence, or conspiracy, they were taken to a holding cell. There, they would wait. Wait for trial. Wait for questioning. Wait for whatever came next. And sometimes, what came next was the ordeal. The ordeal was a form of divine judgment, a test to determine innocence through suffering. One method was the ordeal by hot iron. A bar of metal, heated in flames until it glowed red, was placed into the accused's bare hand. They carried it for a set number of paces, then released it. The hand was bound and examined days later. If the burn had healed cleanly, or so it was claimed, the person was innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Another was the ordeal by water. The accused was tied and lowered into a pool or barrel. If they sank, they were innocent, purified by the water. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the elements. These ordeals were not universal. Some regions had banned them, others used them liberally, but in every case, they were less about truth and more about control. Then came the interrogations, when a confession was needed, especially in crimes involving heresy, treason, or conspiracy. The prisoner might be taken to a special chamber, not always called a torture room, but everyone knew. The instruments varied. There was the strappado, the prisoner's hands bound behind their back, a rope looped over a beam. They were lifted from the ground and dropped. Not far, just enough to pull the shoulders out of socket. There was the rack, a wooden frame with rollers on each end. The prisoner lay upon it, wrists and ankles tied. Then, the rollers turned, slowly, pulling, stretching. Then the thumb screws, simple devices, metal clamps that crushed the fingers or toes. Screws were tightened gradually. There was no blood, but the pain was extraordinary. And then, the boot, a wooden casing placed around the leg, wedges driven into it, one at a time, crushing the shin. Most of these devices were not designed to kill. They were designed to break the will, to wear down resistance, to extract a name, a confession, a signature. And often, they succeeded. Because the goal was not justice in the modern sense. The goal was affirmation. That the system worked. That the accused confessed. That the punishment matched the crime. If a confession was obtained, the record was written. Sometimes, it was signed. though many prisoners could not write. Instead, they marked it with a trembling X. Then, sentencing. Punishments varied: whipping, branding, amputation, fines, for those who had something to lose, time in the stocks, or, if the crime was serious enough, execution. But for many, the sentence was simply imprisonment, thrown into a cell and left, not for days, not for weeks, sometimes for years, with no trial, no appeal, no defense. Because in the end, medieval justice was not designed to protect the accused. It was designed to protect the structure, the church, the lords, the land, and the dungeon. That was where the story stopped, or slowed so much, it may as well have ended. Justice was rarely blind in the medieval world. It could see quite clearly the difference between a peasant and a noble, between a man and a woman, between someone useful and someone expendable. The methods of judgment were not consistent. A man accused of stealing a loaf of bread might be flogged that same afternoon. A woman accused of witchcraft might wait months for a hearing, and even then, never truly be heard. A drunk noble could insult a bishop and walk away with a fine. A commoner who dropped a coin during mass might lose a hand. The law was not one set of rules. It was layers, local customs, lordly ecclesiastical codes, royal mandates, and the will of whoever held the most power in the room that day. Sometimes, villagers held their own courts, manorial courts, presided over by the local lord, or his steward. These were intimate affairs, held in barns or open halls. Neighbors gathered to settle disputes about fences, pigs, broken promises. The accused would speak, witnesses would nod, the lord would listen and render a decision. Fines were common, punishments were short, but even here, imbalance thrived. If you had favor, you had leniency. If you did not, even if you were right, justice could turn away. More serious crimes went to royal courts, ecclesiastical courts, or castle tribunals. There, things became more formal. Robes were worn. Clerks took notes. Language grew heavy with Latin and ritual. But still, the accused were often at a disadvantage. They rarely understood the charges fully. They had no lawyer, not in the modern sense. They stood alone, surrounded by authority, even when they were innocent. There were stories of mistaken identity. A man arrested for robbery because he resembled someone else, held for months, only to be forgotten. A woman accused of poisoning her husband, though it was illness, and condemned by whispers. A traveling merchant who spoke a different dialect, misunderstood, mistrusted, jailed. Appeals were rare. Even if you managed to send a petition to a higher authority, it could take months or years to reach the right ears. Most didn't survive that long. Records from some towns show cases where the same name appears for years, with no resolution, no release, just a scribbled note, or, worse, no further mention. Justice was slow, deliberate, and sometimes it simply stopped moving. Torture was not always used, but when it was framed as a tool, not a punishment. It was used to obtain truth. That was the word they preferred. Truth through pain. An ugly philosophy, but one that held sway for centuries. In some places, torture required authorization. In others, it was up to the discretion of the judge. Some used it sparingly, others routinely. The church had its own courts, separate from secular ones. Clerics accused of crimes were tried by other clerics, often spared the dungeon, often spared torture. This became known as benefit of clergy, a legal loophole where, if you could recite a passage from scripture, you were considered clergy, and thus untouchable by the king's law. Many memorized verses for this reason alone. Some escaped death because they remembered Psalm 51. Others were not so lucky. There were crimes considered beyond mercy: heresy, treason, sorcery, insulting the king's name, desecrating a holy site, harming a noble's property. These were not mere crimes. They were sins against order itself, and those convicted often met a brutal fate. Public executions served more than punishment. They were reminders of power, of obedience, of consequence. A man hanged in the town square might draw hundreds, children perched on shoulders, vendors selling bread, the priest chanting a final prayer as the rope tightened. The condemned often confessed, sometimes from guilt, more often from exhaustion, and those who didn't confess, they were called defiant, dangerous, proof, somehow, of their guilt. But some were pardoned. Here and there, a prisoner was freed. Not often, and not loudly. Sometimes the Lord changed his mind. Sometimes a bribe made its way to the right hands. Sometimes a family member pleaded, wept, bargained. Sometimes it was simply a mistake. The wrong name crossed out, the wrong seal applied, and the cell door opened for someone who never should have been there to begin with. But they never spoke of it afterward. Not loudly. Not to anyone. Because even freedom could be fragile. One wrong word, and the jailer might remember your face. Confession was the crown jewel of medieval justice, not because it ended suffering, but because it made the whole process feel righteous. A confession validated the accusation. It justified the torture. It soothed the conscience of the judge, the jailer, the watching crowd. Once a prisoner confessed, even under duress, there was little else to do. The record was written. The verdict was marked. The name entered the book. The system had worked, or so it claimed. The truth didn't matter as much as the appearance of truth. There were many ways to draw out a confession. Words, if they came willingly. Pressure, if they did not. The dungeon was designed for both, not only as a place of confinement, but as a quiet persuader. The darkness, the cold, the hunger, all of it softened resistance. A week in the cell did what no blade could. Some prisoners confessed before the first torch was lit. They whispered their guilt to the jailer, or to no one, just loud enough to be heard. Others held out. Those were taken to the chamber. The tools waited there, not hidden, but displayed, neatly arranged, cared for. There was no screaming at first, only the sound of ropes tightening, wood groaning, metal shifting against metal. The prisoner was told to speak. They often did. If they didn't, the pressure increased. Slowly a notch here, a drop there. Torture was not meant to be quick. It was meant to last just long enough. Sometimes a name was all they needed. Sometimes an explanation. Sometimes both. Inquisitors kept notes. Organized, tidy, complete. The questions were written beforehand. The responses recorded carefully. Confessions, even under pain, had to be structured. Who were you with? Where did you meet? What did you say? Did you mean to do harm? The answers didn't need to be elaborate, only consistent. Once the confession was complete, the rest followed. Punishment was not always torture. That was only a means. Punishment came after. A thief might lose a hand, a liar, their tongue, a forger, their ear. The body became a message, not just for the guilty, but for everyone else. You see this man, the sentence seemed to say, this is what disobedience looks like. In cities, the condemned might be whipped through the streets, marched slowly, hands bound, tunic torn, blood trailing in the dirt. The crowd would watch. Some would jeer, some would pity. Most would look, then forget. The punishment was theatrical. It had to be. Justice, in its medieval form, was a public ritual. The more visible the sentence, the more effective the warning. But there were quieter punishments, too. A man could be branded on the cheek, on the hand, on the chest, a hot iron pressed until the skin blackened. The mark stayed for life. He would carry it to market, to mass, to his wedding, if he ever had one. Everyone would see, and no matter what he did afterward, he was never again just a man. He was a thief, a traitor. Marked. There was no privacy in judgment. Even when pain was delivered in secret, its result was made visible. Shame was part of the design, not just guilt, but memory. Sometimes punishment was exile, a person driven from their village, sent beyond the walls, told not to return. Their home left behind, their name whispered in caution. But most remained, not by choice, because the dungeon had no doors that opened easily. Some prisoners were kept indefinitely, not dead, not tried, just waiting. Too dangerous to release, too inconvenient to execute, too forgotten to matter. Their names lived only on a list, or in the mind of the jailer. Their bodies withered in the dark, and when they died, there was no ceremony, no procession, no bell, only a note in the ledger removed. You are awake. Or at least, you think you are. In the dungeon, there is no sunrise, no rooster crowing, no warm splash of light across stone walls. Only the damp, the cold, and a distant sound. The scrape of boots, a rattle of chains, perhaps a cough behind a wall you'll never see through. There is no clock. Time flows slowly, in long stretches, then disappears entirely. A day in the dungeon begins with movement. A door creaks open. A heavy footstep enters the corridor. You hear the jailer before you see him. He doesn't speak. He rarely does. He drops something through a hatch. A crust of bread. A wooden cup of water. Sometimes it spills before you can reach it. You lap it from the stone. Not because you are desperate, but because that's what you do now. You have learned not to expect more. No porridge. No salt. Only the dry, flavorless bread. Hard enough to break a tooth. But still, something to this moment, the arrival of food, is the day's most certain event. There is no other routine more dependable. Once, you tried to count time by meals. Now, you've stopped. Time doesn't belong to you anymore. You sit, or lie, or lean against the wall with your knees drawn up. You try to stretch, but there isn't room. The chain that holds your ankle is just long enough for 3 steps forward, 1 step back. You've taken those steps so many times. The floor is worn smooth beneath your feet. You've memorized the cracks in the wall. You've given names to the mice. You've grown used to the smell. Or maybe your nose has simply given up noticing. You urinate in the corner. You've been told to use the bucket, but the bucket is already full. The jailer doesn't always empty it. When he does, it means someone else has died. That's when he has space to care. You wonder how many have sat here before you, scratching initials into stone, wishing for sunlight, rehearsing prayers. Your own initials are there, barely visible now, carved with a bit of broken pottery weeks ago. Or was it months? You no longer remember how long it took you to forget the sound of your own name. Now, you listen. You listen for rats, for the splash of water dripping from the ceiling, for the telltale squeak of leather boots on stone that might mean your turn has come. For punishment, for transfer, for something you can't predict. You hear others, sometimes. A man crying out in the dark, a woman sobbing gently in the cell across from yours, someone cursing the jailer in a voice so raw it barely rises above a whisper. No one answers. Even the loudest prisoners grow quiet, eventually. The silence wins. You try to recall the color of the sky. Was it always so bright? Or do you just remember it that way? You think of grass, how it feels beneath bare feet. You try to recall the taste of onions, or of wine, or of meat roasted over fire. But the more you try, the more those memories shift. Like dreams, slippery, unreliable, fading as soon as you grasp them. So instead, you focus on what's real. The scratch of your nails against stone. The ache in your back. The damp spot beneath your hip where water pools each night. The occasional movement in the dark. A beetle, perhaps, or something larger. These sensations are yours. They are honest. Sometimes, you try to speak aloud, just to hear a voice, even if it's your own. At first you said prayers, Our Father, who art in heaven, ... But the words grew harder to finish. They seemed too hopeful. Then, you tried songs. Just a few lines, something your mother used to hum. But your voice cracked, and your throat was dry. So now you hum. Sometimes, very softly, so softly, in fact, you wonder if you're only imagining the sound. Time slips by, but the hours do not change. There is no sunbeam to follow across the floor. No bell to toll midday. Only the shifting sounds of life beyond your walls. A clang in the courtyard. The low murmur of a distant voice. The heavy groan of a door you'll never pass through. You sit with your thoughts. They are not sharp anymore. They come in waves. Heavy, soft-edged, uninvited. Sometimes you remember your trade. Were you a baker, a smith, a scribe? The memory arrives incomplete. You see the shape of an oven, but not the fire. You smell ink, but can't recall the letters. You remember the ache of work, but not the pride of it. You think of someone's face. A wife, a brother, a child with dust on their cheeks and a runny nose. Their name hovers on your tongue. You whisper it again and again, but it never sounds quite right. You stop trying. You trace patterns in the grime on the wall, shapes that have no meaning. Spirals, loops, lines. You draw a house. You draw a tree. You draw a door, over and over again. Your fingers become sore. You keep drawing. Sometimes you think you hear someone calling your name. You rise, or try to, but it was nothing. A voice in your head, or the echo of something you once hoped for. You begin to talk to yourself more often. It's not conversation. Not really. Just sound. To prove you still can. I'm still here, you murmur. There's no reply. Of course there isn't. You tap your fingers on the wall in rhythm. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. You wait. Once someone tapped back. That was weeks ago. Or years. You're not sure if they were real. Eventually, you lie down again. Your body knows its places now. The bump in the stone where your shoulder rests. The dip in the floor where your hip fits. The straw, long since flattened, still provides some buffer against the cold. You scratch your beard. It's grown long, coarse. You tug at it, then stop. The hair is thinning. Like everything else, sometimes you hallucinate. You see a bird flitting across the ceiling. You hear a market bell. You smell smoke and sweet apples, as if someone nearby is cooking. Your stomach tightens at the memory. You close your eyes. When you open them again, the bird is gone. There is no smoke, only the damp, metallic scent of stone. You reach for your cup. It's empty. You shake it anyway. Nothing. You lick your lips. They're cracked. You press your sleeve to them. The cloth is damp from the wall. You press harder. It doesn't help. A mouse scurries past. You watch it without moving. For a moment, you imagine speaking to it. You imagine it stops, turns, and listens. You whisper a secret. Take me with you. It doesn't. You listen to the drip again, the one you've heard since the first day, or perhaps the second. A slow, steady beat. You tried to measure time by it, tried to count the hours, but the rhythm changed. Or maybe you did. Now, it's just background. Like your own heartbeat. Like the creak in your bones when you shift. Something to hold on to as the quiet thick. You drink if there's water left. If not, you make do. Your tongue moves slowly. Your throat feels dry. As always, you shift in place. Stretch your legs, as far as the chain allows. Move your toes. Flex your hands. The cold is deeper now. The stone floor no longer just cool, but biting. You curl into yourself, pressing your knees close, tucking your hands beneath your arms. Sleep will not come soon. Not because you're not tired, but because sleep here is a skill. It requires surrender. Something you don't always have. You stare into the dark, at nothing in particular. The shapes in the walls no longer entertain. You've traced them too many times. You feel your heartbeat, in your fingers, just your own breathing. Sometimes you think of escape, not in practical terms. There is no escape, but in imagining what it would feel like to walk barefoot on grass. To hear a bird, to hold a cup of warm water in two steady hands, to sleep in a bed, not even a soft one, just one raised from the ground. The thoughts fade, not because they are painful, but because they lead nowhere. You reach down and rub your ankle where the chain digs in. The skin is raw. Again, you tug slightly. Not to test it, just to feel it there. It has become part of your body. You wonder if there are stars above you. If somewhere far overhead, the sky is clear. If someone is looking up and breathing cool night air. You miss the sound of leaves, the rustle of them in wind, the way they danced above the road outside the village. You try to picture them now. Red, yellow, brown, falling. But the image doesn't stay. Your mind grows fuzzy. Thoughts drift. You cannot hold on to them long. That is the rhythm of the dungeon. Even thinking takes effort. You rest your head against the wall. The stone is slick. You don't mind. You murmur a few words aloud. Nothing important. Just sound. And then, without deciding to, you begin to count. Not for any reason. Not to reach a number. Just to count. The sound of a key turning in a lock is unmistakable. Even now, centuries later, it lingers in the imagination. A low scrape. A final click. A door that will not open again until someone else decides it should. In the medieval world, the key was more than a tool. It was a symbol of power, a promise of safety for some, a sentence of silence for others. And beneath every dungeon, beneath every trial and punishment, there lay the simple mechanics of captivity: iron, wood, stone, and time. The jailer, before anything else, was a keeper of closures. He knew his locks, not the sleek, factory-pressed designs we know today, but rough, handmade devices, wrought iron, thick and stubborn, each lock unique, crafted by hand with the care of a blacksmith, not a locksmith. The oldest types were warded locks. Simple in concept, complex in practice. A rotating key would align with internal obstructions, wards, and if the shape matched, the bolt would slide free. But the jailer didn't need dozens of keys. Often, one would do, because not every cell needed to stay locked. Only the ones that mattered. The prisoners heard the key before they saw it. Sometimes long before. It rang against the jailer's belt, a cluster of cold weight. It scraped along stone walls. It stopped before the cell, paused in a moment of terrible stillness, and then turned. You could tell a great deal from how a lock was used. A slow turn meant routine. A quick twist might mean trouble. A struggling bolt, rust, or neglect, or urgency. Some doors had 2 locks. One to close, and one to seal. Others used sliding bolts across the outside. Wooden bars, swollen with damp, groaning with age. The cells themselves had no knobs, no handles on the inside. Only a viewing slit, and perhaps, if one was lucky, a small grate for air. And then there were the chains. Every jailer had them, hung them from hooks, laid them in coils beside the door, carried them across their shoulder, like a burden no one asked them to explain. Shackles were common, 2 thick iron cuffs connected by a short length of chain, sometimes for ankles, sometimes wrists, sometimes for both. The cuffs were not fitted with care. They were one size foremost, too tight for some, too loose for others. They chafed, they bruised, they dug into skin until the skin stopped protesting. Some were riveted shut. Others used a padlock. The key for those was small, just a sliver of metal, but a symbol of everything. There were collars, too, used less often, but still there. A ring of iron, heavy enough to press down the head, attached to the wall with a short chain, good for keeping a prisoner seated, or submissive. And then there were the manacles that pinned arms above the head. For display, for warning, no matter the style, all served one purpose: to reduce movement, to restrict the body, and, by extension, the mind. Some restraints didn't need keys at all. The stocks, for instance, a wooden frame with 2 thick planks, hinged and bored with holes. A prisoner's ankles or wrists would be slipped inside, and the top plank dropped shut. There was no slack, no adjustment, no comfort. Once locked, you stayed there for hours, sometimes days, not always in darkness either. Stocks were just as common in open courtyards as in dungeons, meant for public shame, not private silence. Then came the pillory, similar in shape, but mounted vertically. Your neck and wrists inserted at once. The weight of your own head became the punishment, but down in the dungeons, punishment was quieter, more constant. The wall rings were a favorite, a simple iron loop mounted to a stone wall with heavy bolts. From this, a chain could be passed. Not too long, just enough to sit, or kneel, not enough to stretch, and never enough to lie flat. Sometimes the chain was attached to a belt, sometimes to a collar, sometimes to nothing more than a crude iron hook pressed into flesh-hardened fabric. There were iron cages too, though rare in smaller prisons, not the standing kind shown in paintings. Those were theatrical, but low cages, just large enough to crawl into. The top would be barred and locked. You couldn't sit upright. You could only curl. They were used for prisoners who screamed too often, or tried to resist, or were meant to be broken slowly. No room to move, no room to dream. In some cases, a prisoner might not even be chained, because the architecture did the job. Cells were built deliberately, low ceilings, thick doors, no airflow. A slab of stone in one corner might serve as a seat, or a bed. Sometimes, iron rings were sunk into the floor, chains attached, loose enough to allow pacing in a circle. Always a circle, never a line. Those rings were worn smooth from years of tugging. They outlived the prisoners who used them. Then, there were the thumbscrews. Not common in every jail, but present in places where pain was part of policy. A small clamp, a screw turned slowly, the bones of the finger compressed, crushed. It wasn't just about securing someone, it was about subduing them. And still, the most powerful restraint was the door. Thick timber, sometimes often swollen with moisture, heavier than it looked. Some had observation hatches, little windows that slid open from the outside, not for the prisoner's benefit, but for the guards, to see if you were alive, to see if you were ready, to see if someone had visited you in the night who wasn't supposed to. The hinges on these doors groaned, deliberately, perhaps. There was no sneaking up in a dungeon. If you heard the door, it was coming for you. If you didn't, it never opened at all. The padlocks used on them varied. Some were so large, they looked more like sculptures. Others were small, rusted, barely holding on, but still effective. The key was always elsewhere. The prisoner never saw it, never touched it, never held even the hope of it. That was the language of confinement. You were allowed to breathe, allowed to blink, allowed to think, but never allowed to open anything. The tools of confinement were never just tools. For the jailer, they were a language, a ritual, a way of ordering the world. Each morning, before the prisoners stirred, or before they were allowed to, he would inspect the chains. Not for rust, not for weakness, but for silence. A good shackle made no sound when I dole. It lay flat. It didn't shift or rattle unless provoked. If one did, he checked it. He carried a small pouch at his waist. Inside were the things no one saw. A square of cloth for wiping oil into metal links. A rough brush for scraping rust from iron rings. A small file, meant not to free, but to smooth edges that might catch fabric, or skin, or thought. He never spoke to the chains, but he knew them. There was the ankle cuff with a dent near the hinge. It had belonged to a boy who wouldn't stop pacing. There was the collar with a missing rivet, still functional, but unreliable when tugged. There was the loop of chain that no longer bent, right? Something, or someone, had tried too hard. He kept them, not because they were useful, but because they were known. The locks he cleaned more carefully, especially the old ones. A single key might turn 10 doors, or only one. He never labeled them. He didn't need to. The shape, the weight, the way each one sat in his palm told him enough. He remembered which turned to the left, which needed a jolt, which whispered open like it wanted to be forgotten. Some days, he would test the bolts, not because he expected escape, but because routine demanded it. Slide the latch, feel the catch, let it fall back into place. The sound was comforting. It meant things still worked, still held. There were days when he lingered longer by the chains than he did by the prisoners. The prisoners changed, they weakened, they died. The tools did not. They aged. Yes, rust bloomed along certain edges, iron pitted, wood cracked. But they remained. They didn't speak, didn't beg, didn't weep when the door closed behind them. He had once tried to oil a chain during the night shift. He imagined the ghost of a prisoner still bound by invisible chains, wandering the dungeon in endless loops, always ending where he began. It didn't frighten him. It just felt familiar. At night, when he locked the last door, he would sit with his tools, lay them out on a cloth, wipe them, slowly, not because they needed it, but because it calmed him. Iron on cloth, cloth on hand, hand on chain, order, control, the quiet assurance that everything for now remained locked. A chain is not just a chain, it is a boundary, a rule spoken in metal. It says, this far and no farther, and though it may weigh only a few pounds, the mind carries it long after the iron is gone. Prisoners released from their shackles often walked as if still bound, their gait shortened, hands resting at the same angle they were once held. Even when the chain is removed, the echo lingers. The mind becomes accustomed to restraint. It adapts. It forgets how to stretch. Some prisoners, given freedom again, did not leave immediately. They stood in place, unsure. They glanced at the wall, expecting the iron ring to pull them back. They rubbed their wrists, not in pain, but in disbelief. The marks left behind were not always visible. Bruises faded, scars softened, but the memory of immobility remained. One prisoner, it was said, had been held in the same cell for so long that when he was pardoned and let up into daylight, he collapsed after 2 steps, not from hunger, but because his knees had forgotten what openness felt like. Another refused to sleep in a bed again. The straw mat on the floor, the chill of stone, that was what comfort had become. Freedom was not always a relief. It was a disruption, a shock to the rhythm of confinement, like waking too fast from a long sleep, and yet others never left at all. Some dungeons were simply where people were forgotten. Their chains rusted into the wall. Their bones rested beside iron loops. No one came to unlock anything. Time did the unlocking instead. Centuries passed. Doors fell away. Locks crumbled. Modern hands, archaeologists, historians, caretakers, uncovered them. An old hinge here, a padlock there, a section of chain fused into a stone block. No stories, no names. Just the shapes of silence, made visible again. Some museums now display these relics behind glass. Visitors walk past, reading neat labels. Medieval ankle restraint, 13th century. Iron collar, recovered from castle dungeon. They imagine the past for a moment. Then they move on. But the object remains, still, mute, heavy. It carries no malice, no intent, only memory. Some historians argue that the dungeon was not about cruelty, It was about order, that the chains were not punishments, but tools of a legal system, that restraint was necessary. But to the prisoner, the logic did not matter. What mattered was the cold, the stillness, the moment when the chain stopped moving and you realized it would not move again until someone else chose to. And sometimes no one did. It is a different kind of silence, not the damp hush of stone, not the empty stillness between footsteps, but something deeper, a silence of thought, of belief. You are here not because you stole, not because you struck, but because of what you whispered, because of what you refused to deny. In the world outside, belief is an anchor, a source of purpose, of peace. But in the medieval dungeon, belief could be dangerous, too strong, and it became heresy, too vocal, and it became rebellion. They did not chain your hands first. They questioned your words, your prayers, your gods. And when you refused to recant, they brought you here. The walls are the same as any other prisoner. The floor, just as hard. The food, just as stale. But your cell is more than a place of confinement. It is meant to unmake you, to pull apart the layers of your thought, to wear down the rhythm of your prayer, to replace certainty with doubt. They do not speak much after you arrive. The Inquisitor has already done his part. Now, time will do the rest. You are alone. No voice answers when you speak. No sound follows when you sing. At first, you pray aloud, filling the space with sacred phrases whispered into the darkness. But the stone does not echo back. It absorbs, it consumes. Days pass, or weeks, or something between, and slowly the prayers grow quieter. Not because your faith has faded, but because your voice is. Still, you repeat them, mouth forming familiar shapes, hands curled into forgotten signs. You remember the chapel, the wooden pews, the scent of wax and dust. You remember the warmth of shared belief, the way a hymn filled the room. Here, it fills only your lungs, and then it vanishes. You were a scholar once, or a preacher, or a curious mind. You read the wrong scroll, or asked the wrong question, or wrote down something others feared to say aloud. They told you it was for your own salvation, that the cell was a mercy, a pause, a space to reconsider. But nothing in this place feels like grace. Your cell is narrow, bare, the only decoration a crack in the far wall, where cold air slips through in threads. You count your prayers, not because you must, but because counting gives the day shape. And sometimes, when the thread of light touches the floor just right, you feel something like presence. Not divine, not quite, but enough. There were no sermons here, no voices raised in triumph, no congregation to echo your words. Only stillness, only yourself. And eventually, even that began to change. Your thoughts, once clear, full of scripture and logic, began to circle, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in confusion. What day was it? Had the sun risen twice or thrice since your last bread? Was that yesterday or just earlier? The mind, unmoored from routine, finds strange rhythms. You notice the dripping sound from somewhere beyond your wall, a slow tap every few seconds, then a pause. Then again, you began to count it, not to mark time, but to prove you could. 1, 2, 3, 100, perhaps. Then you'd lose your place. Begin again. At first, the prayers helped. They gave structure, anchor points. You could recite verses in order. You knew the cadence. But repetition has limits. After a while, even sacred words began to unravel. You forgot lines. You substituted one for another. You merged verses. Then one day, you stopped halfway through a prayer and did not remember how it ended. It felt like betrayal, but only for a moment, because in that silence, that soft, echoless stillness, you realized that forgetting wasn't the same as losing. Your faith hadn't gone. It had simply changed shape. It no longer lived in words. It lived in breath, in pulse, in the simple refusal to give in. You sat straighter that day, or tried to. Your back ached, your joints stiff, but your eyes opened more fully in the dim. You remembered your teacher, how he had once said that belief was not always noise, that silence, too, could be sacred. Here, you began to understand what he meant. Sometimes, you imagined others, like you, in other cells, in other towers, speaking the same prayers, feeling the same doubt. You would never meet them, but they existed, surely. You felt them, like distant lanterns, glowing behind walls of stone. Perhaps that was the body of faith. No, not a church, not a book, but a quiet network of minds, held together by hope. Faith was not merely tested here. It was measured, prodded, observed. Not with instruments of torture, at least, not always, but with long silences, repetitive questions, strategic isolation. This was not the rack, nor the wheel. This was something quieter. The Inquisitor's role did not end at the trial. Sometimes, it continued in spirit. He would not enter your cell, but his presence would still be felt. Through the meals that stopped arriving, through the sudden movement to a colder room, through the replacement of your straw with bare stone. It was not to punish, it was to unsettle. They believed in correction, that the mind could be softened like wax. That belief could be shaped, if warmed just enough, and pressed just so. They asked not for your pain, but your signature. A mark, a confession, a retraction. It didn't need to be eloquent. It only needed to be public. They preferred converts to martyrs, so they offered light, a candle, a bowl of broth, a cleaner cell, all for a single word: I recant. Some gave it, not because they believed it, but because they no longer believed in themselves. Others refused. Even when the chill crept deeper into their bones, even when the shadows stretched longer, they clung to their silence like a final prayer. One prisoner was said to have written psalms into the dust on the floor with his fingernail. He erased them each night with his foot, lest someone think him defiant. Another hummed a hymn under his breath, so quietly it became more breath than song. The cell, in these moments, became a sanctuary, not because it was holy, but because it was all that was left. Even without icons, without altars, without communion, faith persisted, in the rhythm of breathing, in the refusal to sign a page, in the memory of a single verse, repeated again and again like a heartbeat. Not every prisoner of faith remained in chains forever. Some were released, but they did not return as they had entered. Those who left often did so quietly, through back gates, at dusk, given a bundle of cloth and told to disappear. They were marked, not by iron, but by memory. Villagers whispered when they passed, some with admiration, some with fear. He was in the dungeon, they would say, as a heretic, and though the word was meant to wound, it sometimes carried an edge of or. For the dungeon was not only a place of punishment, it was a place of and those who endured became something else. Not saints, not outcasts, something in between. Others never left at all. Their cells were emptied, swept, locked again, their names scratched from the rolls. In rare cases, a final mark would be carved into the stone, a cross, a date, a name, sometimes incomplete, but more often nothing was left. Just the chain, the wall ring, a worn spot in the floor where someone had knelt for too long. Archaeologists find them, now and then. A narrow cell, a shallow groove, a rusted loop with no known purpose. They write reports, catalogue the item, speculate, but they do not always know the prayers once whispered there, the verses etched with a thumbnail, the quiet resistance behind the silence. Still, traces remain. In old letters, in forgotten court records, in the cautious footnotes of religious texts, and in the stories passed down in secret of men and women who would not bend. Faith leaves marks. Not always visible, but enduring. Even stone, in time, remembers where a voice once refused to fade, and so the dungeon becomes not just a place of darkness, but a vessel of persistence, a reminder that even in the deepest stillness, something can remain unbroken. Castles rose like teeth above the hills, stone crowns on high ground, layered in battlements and banners. There were symbols of power, fortresses against rebellion, homes to nobles and knights, but beneath the grandeur, always beneath, there were dungeons, hidden away, tucked beneath courtyards and kitchens. They pulsed like a second heart, dark, slow, unseen. Not all castles had them, but the ones that did kept them close. Close to the earth, close to fear. These were not vast prison complexes. They were smaller, more personal, not meant to hold armies of criminals, but individuals. A messenger who said too much, a rival noble's servant caught spying, a disgraced knight, a rebellious steward, or sometimes no one at all. The noble lord simply wanted a place to remind others. This is what happens when you forget your place. Beneath the warmth of the hearth, the laughter of feasts, the polished armor and practiced smiles, The dungeon waited. Often, its entrance was hidden. A narrow stair behind a tapestry, a trapdoor beneath a ladder, a corridor sealed by iron, its lock known only to the Lord. There were stories of guests disappearing after a dispute, of a jester who mocked once too loudly, of a cook who knew something she shouldn't. No trial, no priest, just stone. Inside, the cells were crude. Some were little more than closets carved into rock. Others had proper doors, locks, chains. But all had that same stillness. No windows, no fire. Only the soft drip of groundwater, the scratching of rats, and the weight of distance from the world above. Some lords used them regularly, others rarely, but they were always maintained. A dungeon that falls into ruin is a risk. It must remain ready, even if empty, just in case. The Lord did not visit the dungeon. Not directly. That was left to the steward, or perhaps the castellan, sometimes the captain of the guard. It was not a place for silks and rings. It was a place for keys and echoes. Once a week, perhaps more, if someone occupied it. The dungeon was checked, not cleaned. Exactly. There was no scrubbing of walls, no polishing of iron, but it was kept serviceable. Mold was scraped away from corners. Buckets were emptied. Chains inspected for rust or weakness. A dry dungeon was rare. Most were damped by nature, built into bedrock, pressed beneath stone. The moisture seeped in slowly, uninvited. Some dungeons smelled of old blood, others of rot, but most simply smelled like the end of a place, not death, but absence. A blank part of the castle. Above, life continued. One account, from the steward of a lesser-known northern castle, described his duty thus: I check the locks, and feed the prisoner. I am not told why they are there. I am not told when they will leave. I do not ask. I only count the steps down, the chains in place, the days since their arrival. Some prisoners were noble themselves, a cousin with dangerous ambitions, a daughter who refused a match, a son who spoke out of turn. For them, the cell was a pause, a reminder, a chilling interlude, before apology. Others were servants, too low to be publicly tried, too troublesome to be left loose. Their imprisonment might last a day, or a decade. There were cases, sparse and uncertain, of prisoners forgotten entirely, keys lost, guards replaced, doors sealed, out of habit more than purpose. When a new lord inherited the estate, he might ask what was beneath the floorboards, and someone would say, I believe there's a chamber down there, and upon opening it, they would find nothing, or someone, or the remains of someone. Still bound, still unnamed. The dungeon was more than a room. It was a rumor, a shadow that stretched upward, through the floors above. Even when empty, it affected behavior. Servants moved with more caution. They remembered not to gossip near open doors. They lowered their voices when speaking of the Lord, because beneath their feet, beneath the kitchen, the hall, the chapel, there was always the possibility of punishment without ceremony. Not the spectacle of the scaffold, not the shame of the stocks, but something far quieter, unseen. You could vanish, and no one would speak your name again. This silence created a kind of order, not one written in ledgers or posted on gates, but one lived out in the slight hunch of shoulders, the pause before answering a question, the nods that came a second too late. Children of the staff were warned. Never speak of the lower stairwell. Never touch the iron ring near the pantry. Never ask who used to sleep in the old cell behind the chapel. And so the dungeon became a myth, even among those who walked past its door daily. There were stories, of course, always stories, of a girl who fell in love with the wrong knight, of a scribe who forged a seal, of a cook who dropped a dish during a feast. Most of them were likely untrue, but they did their work. They planted caution, and that caution shaped the castle more effectively than laws. Even the noble family felt it. There are accounts, letters, journals, half-arrest notes, in which young heirs mention their fear of the cold room. One writes, I did not sleep well. I dreamt of the dungeon again, though I have never seen it. I think I heard something, or perhaps I only imagined it. Father says it must stay locked. They feared becoming its occupant. They feared needing to use it, and so the dungeon sat at the very bottom of the castle's life, like a clenched jaw beneath a polite smile, rarely opened, but never truly forgotten, because to forget it would be to remove the spine of authority. It was not just the Lord's sword that ensured obedience. It was the silence beneath his home. Time changes walls, even stone bends, given enough centuries. The castles that once towered with menace now sit quietly in the landscape ruins. Museums, backdrops for weddings and tours, and beneath them the dungeons remain, not in use, but in place. Tour guides point to stairwells sealed with iron gates. Visitors peer through the rusted bars. Cameras flash. This was the dungeon, the guide says, where the Lord kept his prisoners. It is said matter-of-factly, with a smile, perhaps a chuckle. The group nods. The children wrinkle their noses. Then they move on to the banquet hall. But the air changes down here. Even now, it is colder, stiller, less touched by light. Many dungeons were filled in over the centuries, covered with earth, converted to wine cellars, repurposed as storage. But some remained, untouched, sealed, waiting. When archaeologists open these places, they sometimes find more than stone: a ring in the wall, a chain, a bowl, the faint outline of a cot, scratches along the doorframe, too deliberate to be accidents, and sometimes nothing at all. But even the emptiness tells a story, of presence once held, of silence once practiced. The noble dungeon was never meant to be permanent. It was built for control, for moments of discipline, for holding something or someone in stasis. But in surviving, it became more. It became memory, without names, fear, without sound, a space where authority once whispered and was obeyed without question. Today, we walk past these chambers with detachment. They are curiosities, artifacts. Yet part of us understands, still, that they were not built from cruelty alone. They were built from fear, and the need to shape it. A room to remind everyone above it that safety could be taken, that comfort was conditional. And in that reminder, loyalty was maintained. Even now, centuries later, that lesson echoes faintly as your footsteps fall over the old stones. You may never enter the dungeon, but you will remember that it's there, beneath, always beneath. It begins with a whisper, not the kind that echoes down stone halls, but the kind that lingers in folklore, in half-remembered stories told near hearths, long after the castle fell quiet. Every dungeon had its keeper, a man, occasionally a woman, tasked with turning the key, watching the prisoners, feeding them, or choosing not to. Their names are largely lost. Scribes seldom recorded them. Chroniclers focused on lords and traitors, not the one who handed out bowls of water or wiped blood from a hook. But they existed, and they remembered. They walked the narrow corridors by candlelight. They knew the sounds of a man breaking. They knew how long a scream took to fade, and they carried it home. The dungeon keeper lived close to the castle, but not within it. A small cottage just beyond the outer wall, near the woods, or beside the stables. No one visited him. He might have a family, a wife who spoke little, children who learned early to play quietly. But even among the staff, he was set apart. It was not a job that brought pride, nor shame, exactly, but a kind of distance. People avoided his eyes. They nodded too quickly. They forgot his name, even when he'd worked there 10 years. There are tales, from Brittany, from Saxony, from the lowlands, of keepers who began to speak to the walls, who muttered prayers under their breath, who walked in circles even in open fields, not because they were mad, but because silence had changed them. They'd spent too long below ground, too long with the weight of others' endings. Some retired and vanished. Some stayed on even after the last prisoner left. A few were found dead at their post, keys still looped around their belt, candle burned to a stub beside them. Over time, these figures became more than men. They became symbols, figures of dread in local folklore. Children were warned, stay out after dark, and the dungeon keeper will take you. Disobey your mother, and he'll come up from under the hill. The myths took shape. A tall man in a leather cloak, eyes pale as fog, carrying a ring of keys that jingled with the names of the dead. But always silent, always watching. He did not speak. He only opened doors. Ghosts need stories. But stories don't always need names. That's why, across Europe, you'll find castles with no clear records of cruelty. And yet visitors will swear the dungeons are haunted. They speak of footsteps that do not echo, of doors that seem heavier going in than coming out, of sudden chills. Even in the height of summer, they say it's the prisoner, that their suffering left something behind, that spirits linger in the cracks of stone. But more often than not, it's the keeper they feel. The quiet presence, the watcher, Not the tortured, but the one who opened the door and said nothing. There are letters, private, unpublished, from 19th century tourists and scholars who visited old ruins before they were turned into museums. One woman in Scotland wrote, "There is a chamber under the west wall. I felt sure it had once been used as a cell. I did not see anything, but I felt watched, not with malice, but with duty." Another, from the Loire Valley, recalled, "We were given keys to explore the estate freely. I unlocked a narrow stair and found a damp corridor. I heard breathing, though I was alone. It stopped the moment I turned back. The stories repeat across borders, across languages, and the pattern is always the same. Not screams, not violence, but stillness, observation, presence. That, perhaps, is the legacy most keepers left behind. But await, a memory of stillness so profound, it became its own echo. As castles fell into ruin, many of their dungeons collapsed or were sealed off. In some cases, locales refused to open them again, not because of superstition, at least not openly, but because they didn't want to disturb what should stay closed. A polite euphemism for something deeper, because, even long after the keepers had died, their job remained unfinished. The dungeon still held its breath. As history slipped quietly into memory, the dungeon keeper did not vanish. He transformed. He left the stone corridors and stepped into stories. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a fascination with ruins. Castles were romanticized. Decay became picturesque, and the dungeon, once a feared reality, became the perfect setting for fiction. Gothic novels embraced it. So did plays, and later, early cinema. But the keeper, he changed. In books, he was no longer a quiet servant. He became a looming figure, cloaked, gruff, sometimes monstrous, a man of few words, and many chains, grim by profession, shaped more by the fears of readers than the realities of records. In Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, often considered the first Gothic novel, there is no specific dungeon keeper, but the castle pulses with imprisonment, and somewhere off-page, someone must be maintaining the doors, holding the keys. In later works, The Mysteries of Udolpho, Frankenstein, The Monk, the keeper's presence becomes more direct. He may only appear once, but his silhouette, his duty, his silence, they recur. He becomes a metaphor for power without compassion, for routine without thought, for complicity in darkness. Stage plays of the 19th century brought him to life. Literally, audiences watched as hooded figures unlocked cell doors, dragged prisoners into shadow, stood at the edge of scenes and said nothing. Children in the crowd watched and dreamed of keys that could open any door, or feared that same key might one day lock one behind them. By the time cinema arrived, the keeper was fully silent films, with their love for melodrama and shadow, painted him in harsh light, bent back, dragging chains, unsmiling. Later, in fantasy and horror genres, he evolved again, sometimes demonic, sometimes comical, but always solitary. The real keepers, the men who wore plain wool, who lived in quiet houses by the wall, who aged quickly and died early, were gone. What remained was an image, keys, shadows, obedience, and that image continues. In video games, in novels, in Halloween costumes, the dungeon keeper endures. Not as he was, but as we need him to be. A symbol of the burden of control, the silence of complicity, the human face of forgotten cruelty. Even now, in modern fantasy, you'll find him, waiting at the edge of a torchlit hallway, offering no welcome, asking no questions, holding the keys, and waiting to turn them. We began with keys, rusting quietly at the keeper's side. Now we end with them, still there, still cool to the touch, but symbolic now, more than functional, because there are few doors left to open. Most dungeons are tourist sites, or locked by ordnance, or buried beneath centuries of disuse. The chains are gone, the prisoners long buried, the keepers, remembered only in shadow, and yet, we still imagined them, in dreams, in stories, in that moment, just before sleep. When the mind wanders into still corridors, you may find yourself walking slowly down a narrow stone stair, lit only by a torch in your hand, or perhaps not even that. You know you are not meant to be there, but you keep going. The walls close in, the air grows heavier, cooler, and then, a door, wooden, iron-bound, locked, and you wonder, what is behind it? and more curiously, who is holding the key? Perhaps you open it. Perhaps you turn away. Or perhaps the key never existed at all, because the true dungeon, the one that remains long after the stones have crumbled, is not a place, but a memory, a shape in the collective imagination, an echo. We remember the dungeon because it represents a quiet kind of power, not loud, not boastful, but steady, present, the kind of power that waits, that watches, that makes others move carefully, even without speaking. It is not only about cruelty, it is about the fear of silence, and those who kept the keys understood that silence better than anyone. They were not villains, not heroes. They were custodians of order, of secrets, of other people's endings. And now they are gone. The corridors are silent, the chains unmoved, the torches burned out, the watch is over. You may rest now. The keys are on the hook, and no one is coming. Old straw, mildew, sweat, rust, urine, the faint, sharp temps of mold on the walls. But with each passing hour, they blend into a single note, a dense, wet smell you no longer flinch from. It becomes background. When fresh air sneaks in, you barely notice it. Only later, as your skin prickles faintly, do you realize something changed. Your hearing sharpens, instead. Small things grow larger. The scratch of a mouse, the tiny scrape of someone's fingernail dragging across stone, the whistle of wind through a distant opening you've never seen. And your sight, well, your eyes adjust to dark in ways you didn't expect. You begin to see in dim hues, grays, blurred outlines. A faint sheen of moisture on the far wall becomes your landmark. You measure movement by shadow. You know the color of your cell not by its shade, but by how light bends around it. Then there's the feel of things. Not just with your hands, but your skin. Every inch of it. Rough stone behind your back. The crackling dryness of your knuckles. The way your ankles ache, where the iron sits loosely but always. You notice the grain of the bread. The way water feels in your mouth when it's cooler than usual. You can count the threads in your tunic. Eventually, the cell becomes something closer to a companion. Not friendly, not safe, but familiar. The walls you once cursed now define your world. The dripping you once despised becomes the only rhythm you trust. You stop waiting to be rescued, because the mind, when given no clear end, settles for adaptation. You carve your own rituals from the smallest things. A stone placed in one corner, a single hair tied around a finger to mark the days, at least until it's gone. You begin to notice how your body feels when it's doing nothing. The tingling in your feet after sitting too long. The dull weight in your shoulders from hunching over. The way your ribs press into stone when you lie on your side. And sometimes, you wonder if anyone remembers you're here at all. The guards rarely speak. Sometimes, they nod. Sometimes they do not look at you. You become background. Part of the dungeon. Like the dust, like the rusted hook in the wall. And yet, you breathe. You stretch when you can. You hum a tune you thought you'd forgotten. You recite words to yourself, just to keep them alive in your mouth. You think, sometimes, about leaving, not escaping, not in the dramatic sense, but simply what it would feel like to walk out one day, to stand in the sun again, to blink in the light, to feel warmth that doesn't come from inside your chest. And oddly, you feel fear, because this world with its shadows and sounds and damp silences is known to you now. Out there, everything will be too loud, too bright, too full of movement. What if you can't adjust? What if you've become? There are rules in every society, but in the dungeon, they are never written, never spoken aloud, and yet they are followed, not by decree, but by necessity, because in a space where freedom is gone, where light is rare and time is fluid, what matters most is predictability. A sense of order, however, faint, gives shape to survival. So prisoners create their own codes. At first, they are simple. Do not touch what isn't yours. Don't raise your voice. Don't sit where another has slept. These are not just courtesies. They are defenses in a place where emotions have no place to escape. Even small slights can spiral. So most learn quickly to avoid them. When new prisoners arrive, they are watched, not interrogated, just observed how they carry themselves. Whether they ask too many questions, whether they take up too much space in a world with very little of it. Old prisoners, those who have seen many come and go, do not always speak, but they guide. A subtle gesture, A hand raised slightly to pause a newcomer from doing something unwise. And the newcomers learn. They learn not to beg too loudly when the food bowl passes. They learn that silence, at the right moment, is a kind of currency. So among those who've been here longest, there is a quiet balance. They know when to nod, and when not to. They know how to answer a question with just enough truth to comfort, but not enough to inspire escape. Guards, too, follow their own code. It isn't formalized. It varies from jailer to jailer. Some never speak. They bring food, empty waste, buckets, and leave without eye contact. Others offer a glance, a grunted acknowledgement. Rarely, one might speak. But the best guards understand the rule most prisoners live by. Dignity is not taken with the chains. It is something you must be allowed to keep. Even here, in the world above, status is shown through land, wealth, titles, and names. But in the dungeon, those things no longer hold. Your name might be known to the jailer, scribbled in a ledger, or remembered as a case, but to the people in the cells beside you, your story starts at zero. Your lineage matters little when your tunic is as soiled as theirs, when your food comes in the same dented bowl, when your bed is a patch of straw that smells like damp earth and old sweat. And yet, even here, hierarchies emerge. They are not enforced by rule, but by recognition. Some prisoners speak with a steady voice. They ask for nothing, but are listened to. Some know how to calm others without raising their hand. They quiet tensions with a look, a word, a small nod. These become unofficial leaders, not feared, not adored but trusted to know how things work. Then there are the newcomers who arrive with loud words, boasting of noble connections, of armies who will come, of injustice that will soon be righted. Their voices fill the corridor, at first, but volume does not last in the cold stone of the dungeon. Boasts echo back empty. Soon they soften. Their limbs grow heavy. Their eyes grow uncertain. Who curl in corners, who wake only to eat and return to sleep. They do not disrupt. They do not resist. But they are watched by others. Because even silence has a place in the social order. No one mocks them. No one laughs. Because all prisoners see in them a reflection of what they, too, may become. And in that mutual recognition, there is respect, unspoken, but present. Always. In a place so stripped of comfort, the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. A crust of bread shared, even if it means going hungry later. A quiet warning about a surly guard. A gesture of calm when panic begins to build in another's eyes. These are the trades of the dungeon. Not for gain, but for continuity. For a sense of thread when the world has unraveled. You trade warmth for silence. You trade memory for sleep. You trade hope in the morning for stillness at night. No one announces these exchanges. There are no contracts, only instinct. If someone gives you their cup because yours cracked, you clean it thoroughly before returning it. If someone hums while others sleep, you gently place your hand on the floor so they feel the vibration. Sometimes, you trade stories, not grand ones, not lies of castles or victory, but fragments. My sister had a dog with one eye. There's a river in my town that smells like apples in spring. I once fell asleep in a field and woke up covered in bees. No one questions the truth, because truth, down here, is not measured by accuracy. It's measured by the stillness it brings, and by whether the story lingers after it's told. You also learn the signs. Not spoken, not written, but clear, if you know what to look for. A man who chews his thumb is preparing to lash out. A woman who tugs her sleeve is trying to remember something lost. When someone begins to press their forehead to the wall repeatedly, others watch, quietly, carefully. Not to interfere, but to anchor. Sometimes, a prisoner will signal by placing a stone in the middle of the floor. It means, I need space. No one steps near. Sometimes, a strip of fabric is tied to the bars. It means, speak to me, and someone always does. Because conversation, in this place, is a kind of breath. If it goes too long unshared, you forget how to use it. Some cells have traditions. A shared prayer before the meal. A stone passed clockwise each night. Not for any reason, except that it feels ordered. One cell whistles a short tune every time a guard passes. It's not mocking. It's just a way to mark the time. These rituals are not commanded. They arise, and they are obeyed, not from fear, but from reverence. Because the dungeon doesn't take rules from above. It grows them inward, like moss on stone. Each cell its own quiet culture, each group its own rhythm, and within that rhythm, a sense of belonging, however fragile, takes root. There comes a moment, rare and often unexpected, when the door opens for someone. A key to footsteps, pause. A name is read aloud, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. And just like that, one of you is no longer one of you. The first time it happens, you might expect celebration. But joy is not loud here. It moves quietly, like everything else. The departing prisoner often seems dazed. They gather their few things: a cloth, a piece of twine, a scrap of something carved, and they look around, as if the cell itself is difficult to leave, because it is. Even misery, when it is all, becomes familiar. And familiarity is hard to let go of. The others do not cheer, they nod. A few reach out, a hand on a shoulder, a murmured word, barely audible. Remember the song, breathe slow when the sun hits you, don't forget us. And then they are gone. Their place stays empty for a long time. No one moves into it right away. Even in overcrowded cells, that patch of floor remains sacred for at least a few days. Somewhere in the back of every prisoner's mind is the question, what if they come back? Because not all who leave the dungeon leave for freedom. Sometimes they return, changed. Sometimes they never return at all, and no word follows. The rules adjust during these moments. Voices grow softer, routines are reshuffled, silences stretch longer, and everyone watches those who remain. Because departure, whether through release, death, or something in between, reshapes the dynamic. The quiet leader may become quieter still. The quiet one may begin to speak. Someone who had always kept to themselves may begin sharing bread. Rules are never reset all at once. They shift gradually, a nod passed on instead of received. A gesture that once meant silence now invites conversation. The guards, too, sometimes change when someone is released. Some show visible relief. One fewer bowl to fill, one fewer body to watch. Others grow more stern, as if reminded that people do leave. And if they leave, they might speak of what they saw down here. But most often, nothing changes outwardly. Because the dungeon remains, and the next day dawns with the same grey breath and cold stone. And so, the rest carry on, until, one day, another name is read aloud, and the rules shift again, like tides beneath the earth. Unseen, but always moving. In the deep hours of the night, when even the rats grow still and the guards' footsteps fade into long silences, a different kind of voice takes over the dungeon. Whispers, not loud, not bold, just enough to slip from one cell to the next, just enough to drift through the cracks in the stone. These whispers are not commands. They're not truths. Exactly. They are stories, not written down, not verified, but known. Everyone has heard them, and no one claims to have started them. Like steam rising from a pot, these stories simply exist, and they matter, because stories, in a place without sun or clock, are timekeepers. They are reminders that people came before, and maybe, just maybe, some of them endured. One story, passed from cell to cell, tells of the man with two shadows. He had no name, only the rumor, that when the guards opened his door, they saw his shadow and one more beside it. It never moved, it never made a sound, but it was there. And when he was taken away, the second shadow remained. Some say it still flickers on the far wall of the old cell, long sealed, but never truly empty. Another tale speaks of the Hollow Queen. She was nobility, wrongfully imprisoned, or so she said, but she never wept, never begged. Instead, she ruled her tiny cell like a throne. She made court of the mice, named the drips in the ceiling, and issued silent decrees to no one at all. When her time came to leave, no one knows how or why. She stood, dipped her head, and said, "Tell them the stone obeys." No one knew what she meant, but her story is still told, especially by those trying to hold themselves together. In long confinement, some prisoners swear there are songs that only the dungeon knows, not sung by voices, but hummed in the faint whistle of wind through a vent no one can find. A tune that returns on cold nights, always the same for note, always in a rhythm no one can explain. They call it the breath of the below. No one claims to have made it up, but everyone has heard it once. And then there's the most whispered tale of all. The one who left twice. He was taken in as a boy, grew to manhood in the dark, released when his name was cleared, and yet he returned, not as a prisoner, but as a jailer. Some say he walks the halls still, keys silent, eyes soft, never speaking. He does not punish, he does not command, but those who meet him say he pauses before every door, as if remembering what it feels like to wait on the other side. No one has seen his face, no one knows his name, but when food is delivered early, when a broken chain is replaced without pain, when warmth comes in the form of a folded blanket left without a word, they say, that was him. Not all dungeon stories are about people. Some are about the place itself. The stones, after all, have seen more than any prisoner, more than any jailer, and prisoners will tell you, there's one stone you must never touch. They call it the listening brick. It's not marked, it doesn't glow, it doesn't hum or rattle, but if you lean close, closer than comfort allows, and you place your ear against it, they say it listens, not speaks, listens. It draws your breath inward, makes your thoughts ring too loud. It takes the secrets you didn't mean to say, the regrets you thought you'd buried, and tucks them into its cracks. The guards don't know which brick it is, but the prisoners do, and they'll shift their mats, avoid certain patches of wall, warn each other with a glance or a nudge of the foot, because no one wants to wake to find themselves whispering their life's worst memory to cold stone. There's another tale, older still, of a man who escaped without ever using the door. They say he folded himself into the shadows, slipped between the cracks that weren't really cracks, but seemed in the dungeon's skin. He didn't run, he melted, and to this day, his cell remains strangely drafty, even sealed tight. There's always a chill. Some say he became part of the stone, that if you stare long enough at the wall, his outline appears. Others say he never truly escaped, he just moved sideways, and on nights when the guards count wrong, when the bowls come back with one extra scrap of bread missing, when the echoes answer too quickly, they say he's still nearby, watching, waiting, unseen. And then there are the ghosts. Not wailing ones, not the kind with chains or shrieks. These are quiet shapes that appear only when a prisoner is close to breaking. They do not speak, they do not touch. They simply sit, or lean, or sometimes just cast a shadow where no one stands, and their presence is enough. One prisoner claimed he'd seen a guider reach toward his cup and tip it ever so slightly. A breath held in silent thanks. No one knows if the guiders accept them. But the offerings continue, because ritual, in a world of uncertainty, is its own kind of prayer. Some stories speak not of people, but of time itself, because in the dungeon, time doesn't always behave. There's a whisper shared only at the deepest hour of night, about the turning cell. It looks ordinary. Damp wall, iron ring, stone bench. But those who've been inside and made it back out say it doesn't keep time like the others. You enter, serve your sentence, feel every passing hour, like a slow drip of cold water, and then, one day, you're released, but everything's wrong. The guards don't know you. Your name isn't in the ledger. The sun feels hotter. The dialects are slightly off. One man insisted he was gone only a year, but returned to find his village replaced by a stone road in a market square. Another came out to find a tree that had been sapling thin was now thick enough to hug. No one believes these men. But still, the turning cell sits empty more often than not. No guard volunteers to check it, and the door, they say, creaks too slowly when opened, as if reluctant to let go. There's also the tale of the once only voice. It's not a ghost, it's not a person, but some prisoners say that if you stay silent long enough, not just with your mouth but with your thoughts, you'll hear it. A voice, your voice, but older warned. It tells you one thing. Just once. Sometimes it's a name, sometimes it's a phrase. One man heard, "Dig at sunrise." Another heard, "She is still waiting." A woman reported it, whispered, "You are not forgotten," and that was enough. She never told anyone who she was, but she smiled, for the first time in weeks. Others wait their whole sentence and hear nothing. No echo, no phrase. They wonder if they weren't ready, or if they didn't listen quite right, or if the voice spoke, and they were too deep in their own head to hear it. So the legend continues. You must not try to force it. You must not beg it to come. You wait, and if it comes, you remember, because it will not return. And then there is the quietest story of them all, told, not in words, but in shared glances, in pauses between bites, in the way some prisoners touch the wall before sleeping, as if offering thanks. It's the story of a prisoner who lived in silence for decades. No one remembers his name. He had no voice left, not from trauma, but from choice. He simply listened, every day, every sound, and near the end of his time, he was seen smiling. Not from madness, but from understanding. When asked what he'd discovered, he pointed to the wall, pressed his hand to it, and drew a small spiral in the dust. No one knows what it meant, but since then, prisoners have drawn spirals too. Some large, some faint, some no bigger than a coin. They call it the circle of staying. Not surviving, not escaping, staying present, awake to the tiny rhythms that make even a dungeon feel like a world. There is a story, passed in near silence, about a man who was led to the noose but never arrived. The guards opened his cell. His hands were bound. He was marched through 3 doors and down the passage to the gallows. But when they reached the outer yard, he was no longer with them. Vanished. No trace of rope, no dropped step, just gone. They searched the cells, the tunnels, the shadows. Some say he escaped. Others say he was taken. A few whispered that he was never truly real. But in that same cell, where he once waited, the straw remains undisturbed. The air feels cooler. And every prisoner who spends a night there reports strange dreams. Dreams of gates opening that no one else can see. There are legends, too, of footsteps. Not the heavy thud of guards, not the shuffling of chained feet, but soft, rhythmic steps, barefoot. They pass just once, never at the same hour, always behind you, and always followed by the faintest scent. Not of rot or mold, but lavender. No one sees who makes them, but it's said those footsteps belong to the warden's daughter, lost to fever long ago, when she used to visit the dungeon to read aloud to the prisoners. Some say she still walks the halls, not as a ghost, but as memory itself, filling in the silence with what was once gentle. And finally, there's the legend so old, no one remembers where it began. The story of the escape without leaving. They say one man learned how to free himself without digging, without breaking bars, without bribing a soul. He sat in the same corner for 10 years, never moved more than he had to, never begged, never fought, and slowly, day by day, he let the dungeon pass through him instead of resisting it. He breathed in the stone, let the cold sit in his bones, let the routine soften him until he was part of the rhythm. And one day, they opened his door. He stepped out, and the guards, strangely, did not stop him. Not because they forgot, not because they were tricked, but because he no longer belonged to the dungeon. He had become something else, not above it, not beyond it, just free. Even those who don't believe the tale respect its message, because there are prisons that no walls can hold, and there is freedom that doesn't wait for keys. So every now and then, a prisoner will sit quietly, in their corner, hands folded, eyes closed, not planning escape, not seeking rescue, just listening, and maybe, just maybe, stepping slowly into the kind of legend that leaves no trace behind. The final hours in a dungeon are not always marked by clocks. There are no bells to chime the passage of time, no candles to burn down, no sun to set. Just the long, quiet breath of stone, and the rhythm of your own body, the slow echo of existence. For many, the final days are indistinguishable from the rest. There is no grand farewell, no last meal worth remembering. Just a crust of bread, a bowl of thin broth, a corner of straw slightly warmer than the others. But something does change. Not outside, but inside. It begins with stillness, a sense that nothing needs to be done, not even the tiny routines that had once given shape to the days. No stretching of limbs, no rearranging of mats, no soft mutterings. The prisoner simply is, not with defeat, but with a curious kind of clarity, a release of resistance, a full surrender to the moment, not in despair, but in calm. They sit, not to wait, but to be. It is in these moments that the dungeon becomes strangely kind, not in comfort, but in permission. Permission to stop fighting, to stop rehearsing arguments, to stop rewriting the past. The silence offers no solutions, but it takes nothing from you either. No accusations, no demands, just breath, just walls, just being, and in that hush, some prisoners begin to speak to themselves not aloud, but inwardly. They recall small things, not the grand regrets, but the minor, tender details. The way rain sounded on their old roof, the smell of fresh linen on wash day, the sound of a child laughing in the distance, the feel of wool against their cheek in winter. These memories surface without pain. They do not burn, they do not stab, they simply float through like feathers. Some whisper these memories aloud, not to tell them, but to taste them again, and the dungeon lets them. No interruptions. no judgments, just the sound of a quiet voice in a quieter place. Some prisoners begin to lose their sense of where their body ends and the stone begins. This is not madness. It is not delusion. It is merging. The walls no longer feel separate. The cold becomes familiar. Even the creak of old iron begins to sound like part of the rhythm of one's breath. There are prisoners who, in their last hours, have been found sitting upright, eyes open, hands resting gently in their lap. Not with fear, but serenity. They do not speak, but their posture says it all. This is enough. Not the dungeon, not the punishment, but this moment, the simplicity of now, the deep, undemanding stillness. Guards who encounter this sometimes pause. They are trained not to feel, not to see prisoners as people, but even they, in that moment, feel something settle in their chest, a slowing, a reverence. They step away softly, as if afraid to break the calm. There are some who find a kind of light in the very absence of light, not with their eyes, but with their awareness. They begin to sense a kind of glowing spaciousness in the silence, a vastness within the smallness. They say the quiet begins to shimmer, that behind the lack of sound is something fuller than sound ever was, and whether this is memory, imagination, or something beyond either, it brings peace, true peace, not relief, not escape, but the deep recognition that in this stillness, you are not lost, you are not forgotten, you are simply here, and here is enough. Some say the dungeon grants dreams, but only in the last days, not the dreams of fear or old mistakes, but dreams of softness, a warm patch of sun, a bed not seen in decades, a hand holding yours, though no one is there, a voice saying your name, in the way it was said when you were small. These dreams do not demand attention. They do not jolt or burn. They drift through the sleeping mind like birds across a gray sky. They do not need to be understood. They are not meant to be remembered, only felt. And when the dream fades, what remains is quiet gratitude, not for the dream, but for the chance to feel it. Sometimes, after a prisoner is gone, the others notice something missing. Not the body, not the space, but the presence. An absence that is not cold, but warm, as if something good had passed through them and gone on to somewhere gentler. And so they sit, together, in silence. No eulogies, no weeping, just breath, and quiet, and memory. One prisoner might brush the wall where the lost one leaned. Another might leave a scrap of food they no longer need. A third might whisper the name just once to the air, and then they return to silence. But it is a different silence. Richer, softer, wider, as if the dungeon itself is mourning too. You've walked long tonight, longer than you expected, through dark passages of stone, beneath ceilings too low for comfort, past rusted doors and fading voices, and now you are coming back up. But there are no stairs here, no sudden shafts of light, no dramatic exit, just a slow lifting, a slow exhale, like mist rising from warm ground, like waking without truly leaving sleep. Let the cold behind you begin to dissolve, let the walls fade into shadow, and the echo of footsteps grow quiet, not because the noise has stopped, but because you are moving further away from it, drifting. You've seen the chains, but you don't need to carry them. You've heard the silence, but it no longer presses against you. It lingers far behind, like a dream you've decided not to remember. And yet, something comes with you. Not heaviness, not sorrow, but stillness, the kind of stillness you can take with you into the world. A silence that doesn't isolate, but soothes. The hush of understanding that even the darkest places held their own kind of rhythm, their own kind of peace. Breathe, gently. No need to count, no need to control. Just allow your body to remember how it rests, when nothing is required of it. Your hands, they don't need to grasp. Let them soften. Let your fingers unfurl like leaves uncurling at dusk. Your jaw, you can release it. Let it fall open just slightly, the way it does when you are almost, but not quite, asleep. And your shoulders, drop them. Yes, there. Let them sink back into whatever holds you. Pillow, mattress, earth, it doesn't matter. The dungeon is far below you now. So far, you cannot hear its stone breath anymore. Only your own. In, out. In, out. No deeper meaning required. No lesson to take away. Just presence. Just softness. You are safe now. There is no torchlight chasing you. No cold wall behind your back. No list of things you must do tomorrow, not now, not here. You have stepped beyond the stories, past the old cells and forgotten names, beyond the guards and the shadows and the locks. You have entered the space where time forgets itself, where the mind unlaces its boots, lays down its armor, and curls into the warmth of not needing to know anything at all. This is your place, this moment, this breath, this letting go. There's nowhere to get to, no arrival needed, no great sleep you must achieve. Sleep is not a task, it's not a challenge, it's not something you must earn. It is a return to the rhythm beneath your rhythm, to the breath that continues even when you forget it, to the beat that rocked you to sleep before you ever had words for it. You are being held now, by your bed, by gravity, by stillness itself. Let your thoughts slow down, not because you have to, but because they're tired too. They've walked the dungeons with you. They've stood in shadowed corners and listened to ancient voices. Let them sit down now. Even your worries. They can rest. You don't have to solve them. You don't have to list them. They can wait. They will wait, and many will not return at all come morning. Because night is not just darkness. It's restoration. It's dissolving. It's the soft cloth that wipes away what you don't need anymore. You are not disappearing. You are reassembling quietly, lovingly, without needing to control it. So, let the final memories of the dungeon melt into warmth. Let the stone become sand. Let the chains become ribbons. Let the shadows become mist. Let the echoes become lullabies. You do not need to remember every face, every story, every cell. You only need to know that you were there, and now you are here, and here is safe, here is soft, here is warm, and here you can rest. For as long as you need. There is no clock watching, no candle burning down, no pressure, no timeline, only breath, and peace, and the long, slow surrender to rest. You've walked long tonight, and now you are home. Sleep,